Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here. There are people in this room that knew Glen far longer than I did, probably far more qualified to be up here. But I happened to be at the right moment and the right time, and I accept this task with a humble heart, for he is one of the finest men that I have ever known. We are honored beyond imagination today to have Ed Perlmutter here, representatives of the National Western Stock Show, former partners in Glen's law firm, our beautiful Western Air family, and on behalf of Mrs. Keller and the entire family, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. If Glen were here right now, I can hear him sitting over here saying, "Green, would you just get going?" All right. It all began on the 21st of December in 1938. Glen Keller was born and came into this world. He grew up in Longmont to a wonderful family, a family that had good values, good virtues. His dad owned a company called the Keller Truck and Implement Company. So Glen was familiar with farm equipment, trucks, all the things he would later be associated with at Western Airs. It was a beautiful time. A little bit rough in the beginning when he was little. That was a time that we were at war, but by the time he was old enough to really start comprehending and understanding things, we were a nation that had just fought a war on two fronts. People were happy, optimistic, and that's the age that he grew up in. And I like to think of him up there in Longmont just having a wonderful time and just being part of the fabric of this beautiful country of ours. Glen graduated high school in 1956. He was a good student and always did well. For those of us that are familiar with his amazing announcing voice, a voice that none of us will ever be able to forget, that voice, believe it or not, was honed at KLMO radio station up in Longmont, where he was a disc jockey, where he played music by Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Doris Day, Tennessee Ernie Ford, and folks like that. What a wonderful time he must have had. He went on to attend CU seeking a business degree. At a fraternity sorority party up at CU one day with the theme of white, by the way. Glen was in a white bathrobe with white hair when a beautiful young lady named Liz and he caught eyes. They began to talk, began to become friends, began a courtship that would last for just shy of 63 years. They had a close circle of friends, 7 or 8, that were together for years. Some of them are still in contact. One I just met actually the other day, a wonderful man that has known them ever since those college days. They used to play board games and just do really, really fun things together. Graduated from Colorado University in 1960 with a business degree. Shortly after that graduation, on August 14th of 1960, Liz and Glen were wed. He went on to law school, where he graduated at the top of his class in 1964. His first job was with a firm, Hall, Smedley, and Phelps. Later became Phelps, Hall, and Keller. He also spent 8 years on the bench as a judge in the federal bankruptcy court. He served briefly as an assistant attorney general in the state of Colorado. He finished his career at Davis, Graham, and Stubbs, one of the finest law firms in Denver. And there are representatives from that firm here today. He is also, at one point, the chairman of the Jefferson County Republican Committee, served on the school board, and at one point in his career, he had the knowledge, the background, the support, and almost made a run for governor of the state of Colorado. Among the high-profile cases that he handled in his career, he represented Alex English of the Denver Nuggets in a case where Alex sued Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, famous center of the Los Angeles Lakers. What was it Malone said the other day? Who's the Lakers' daddy? We won some championship or some reason. Anyway, he sued Jabbar for $150,000 he claimed that Kareem owed him. and had the papers served in the visitors' locker room at Eagles Week. Later, Kareem countersued, turned into a big ugly mess, which ended in kind of a famous moment where Kareem refused to shake Alex's hand at a playoff game. Glen and Liz went on to have a beautiful family. Patty was born in 1966, Mike in 1968. They had 4 grandchildren, Caroline, Grace, Tatum, and Piper. Mike lives in El Reno, Oklahoma, where he trains quarter horses and is quite well known. Growing up, the family loved to be together, and they loved the outdoors. Glen's parents had a place in Estes Park where they would often go, and the family tradition was to get up in the wee hours of the morning before anybody was in the park. They would grab some honey buns and OJ, get into the best spots of the park before dawn to look for animals. And they would see deer, moose, elk, you name it. And the rule was they could not leave until they'd seen at least one animal, even if it was just a chipmunk. They would go into town afterwards, hang out at places like A&W, get some saltwater taffy. Patty and Mike remember the smells and the sights and the smoke shop there where Glen would get some tobacco for his pipe. Glen, during his career, always tried to arrive at work extremely early so that he could be home for dinner because he loved his family so much and he didn't want to miss dinner time. He cared deeply for his family. He shared a little story with me about the tenderness and kindness of Glen, Grandpa, who they affectionately called Papa. One day at school, Grace was out in the playground and she fell on a rock. She's about 7 years old. And she hit that rock so hard it bruised and skinned her knee. She was bleeding, crying. She went into the office and the people in the office thought, you know what? It's probably best you go home. Well, Papa was the one available, so Glen showed up, walked in those front doors. There's little Grace, and there's some staff there, and she's looking up at Grandpa with tears in her eyes, knee bleeding, and Papa knew exactly the right tender words. He looked down at her and he said, "Is the rock okay?" Glen and Liz joined Western Airs in September of 1977. And the kids, Mike and Patty, immediately started participating. They would later both go on to graduate off of Red Team, as did granddaughters Caroline and Gracie. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Glen loved the organization very, very much and got to know the founder, Elmer Weiland. They began to grow close, and when Elmer died, he chose Glen as his successor. Glen brought expertise and knowledge to the organization that no one had ever had there before. He had a vision from the very beginning of taking the Western Airs to new heights. The facilities, the places they would go, the things they would do. I've talked to a lot of alumni that say the Fort area was pretty run down, not a shambles, but it was nothing to get excited about. And today, look at our Western Air arena, in our area, our volunteer arena, our beautiful kitchen, our museum, all the facilities. None of that would be there if it were not for Glen Keller. His expertise in negotiating, raising funds, and making things happen. The Western Airs became a larger and a better organization because of Glen Keller. And for 35 years, he was their director. A lot of people like to say that Mr. Weiland was the founder, but that Glen Keller was the builder. Along the way, a lot of people don't realize that Glen and Liz Keller personally funded the scholarship fund that has awarded more than 20 scholarships over the years. Glen could be a difficult man to get to know. I hear some. I see some smiles. Betsy Tyus compared going to see him in his office the first time like going to see the principal in grade school. And I must admit that I was quite intimidated and quite scared of the man in the beginning. I was a photographer, and my role was growing quite a bit, so we got to know each other. And initially, I think I did my job somewhat out of fear. You know, I better do a good job, or I'm going to get it. And slowly but surely, as I got to know Glenn a little bit better, I started to do it because I wanted to please the man. Because every time I was around him, I learned something, I felt something that made me appreciate him even more. He seemed to have an ability to know what was right for each person, each individual. If they needed a director that would get a little closer to them to help them, he would do it. If it was somebody that just needed their butt kicked just a little bit, he knew how to do that. But he seemed to have a sixth sense and an insight about how to get the most out of everyone around him. He made decisions, and he stuck to them. Now, a lot of us in the organization, including me at times, didn't always agree with those decisions, but he didn't hesitate. And every decision that he made for the good of the kids and for the good of the organization. I'll never forget one day I was in his office, and we were just talking about something. I think I had questions about an upcoming show and photography and so forth. And I just turned to Glenn and I said, Glenn, you must just really love these kids. And in that sly, subtle wit of his, he immediately replied, some more than others. One day I was looking for Glen, and I called the house and I talked to Liz, and I said, you know where I could find Glen? And she goes, oh, he's out at the fort. I said, really? And she goes, oh yeah. So I ran out to the fort and tracked him down, and I can't remember how many years I was into the organization before I realized the man spent 4, 5, 6 days a week out there. This wasn't just a Saturday job like most of the rest of us. He was out there constantly, dealing with the herd, with maintenance, with finances, with planning shows. His dedication to the organization was incredibly profound. I'm not just a little nervous up here shaking. I would like to share some comments from all of you. The things that have been pouring in on some of the different sites about Glen Keller, I couldn't put better myself, so I'd like to read some to you. Glen believed in me, gave me confidence when others didn't. He helped me realize my dream of graduating from varsity Big Red team, even though I started Western Airs as old as a kid can join. I'm sure that he's announcing drills and guiding things in heaven. Heather Pancratz. Talking with so many fellow writers this morning, we all are so deeply saddened. He was like a father to so many of us. We are so grateful for all he did for us and for the organization. May he rest in peace. Aaron Fry. He greatly influenced me and pushed me to be better every day, and to never give up on something you believe in. My senior stock show with varsity changed everything I thought I knew about him. Despite my horse going down, he made sure that I could still ride and keep my horse there until he recovered and was able to graduate off of him. He always found a way to make it work. He will be deeply missed. Nicole Stillman. Skirmish, skirmish, fight on foot, fight on foot. I giggled every time. Anna Clark. I'll hear that for the rest of my life. At an out-of-town show, I left my trick costume in the school gym. I had to suck up my pride and walk up to him and Mrs. Keller to let them know. I climbed in the back of his caddy, and in dead silence we drove to the school. I remember just wanting to cry. I ran into the school as quickly as possible, and upon returning to his car, I was just so ashamed. In the front seat, Mrs. Keller was smirking. When suddenly, I locked eyes with Mr. Keller in the rearview mirror, and he said, Now, how will I ever explain to the people that my major of Red Team leaves her costume behind? Silence stunned me. He followed up with, I'm not naming officers for a while yet, but I just wanted you to know. We laughed, I cried, and I had to exit his car like I was in so much trouble. Although he had a tough exterior, he was one of the kindest men I had ever met. And to this day, I will never forget the memories we shared. Glen. He was instrumental in molding so many lives. He was strong, with a vision, and pushed to make Western Heirs the amazing group they are today. Thousands of youth and adults have been influenced by his presence and leadership. Rest in peace, the last of a dying breed. Diane Waters. Mr. K was there for me in my darkest and my brightest moments, never once letting me take the easy way out and reminding me about the greatness we all had inside of us. I will forever be grateful for this amazing man and how he was to myself, my family, and the incredible organization. Britt Taylor. Mr. Keller was such an amazing man. When I was younger, I was so scared of him. And I remember the first time at Estes Park that I had to go and tell him I wasn't going to be able to ride my main horse. And the only option I had was my trick horse, which had never been in team. He told me it would be perfectly fine and had no concern at all. During my Western Heirs time, he gave me so many great opportunities, and I will be forever grateful. I am so thankful to have had the opportunity to know him and ride under his instruction. Taylor Elven. Summer of 1986, we were practicing in the rodeo arena. My horse fell, actually tripped and rolled, and as I was getting up, Mr. Keller said, I have you riding 4-1 in the next drill. Are you going to ride, or are you going to sit out? For those of you who don't know, 4-1 is the honored position of leading corkscrew. After making sure my horse was okay, I told him I would ride. To this date, I don't know if he really had me in that position or was just showing me an act of kindness. I even asked him once, and he just smiled at me. There are so many, I'll read one more. Mr. Keller was a man of grit, integrity, and kindness. He believed in individuals and all that they could accomplish when they dedicate themselves to a team. He believed in me, even though I was a kid from a single-parent household and dreaming of being the first person in my family to go to college. I was just a renter. Mr. Keller saw my hard work and gave me the chance to prove my abilities in some tough positions on Red Team. He took the time to get to know the young people in his organization and lifted so many people up. I was the recipient of Western Heirs College Scholarship, and I am so grateful for that gift. I will never forget the sound of his voice over the loudspeaker, announcing with so much pride as we zipped around the arena. I will never get his deep, joyful laugh. I am just so grateful for having known this man. Katie Nowicki. These are the kind of impacts that Glen Keller had on people around him. Grace had another story that she told me. If you think there was any preference towards family members from Glen, in her 5th class in Blue Romans, writing Felwell and Jock, for those in Western Heirs that probably know those two horses. Anyway, Felwell was known to be a little bit of a troublemaker. He bucked Grace off, stepped on her shin, and ran away. She's lying there, her shin is already bruised and starting to swell up. All of a sudden, the white arena doors open up, and here comes Papa. Get up, walk it off. She's like, what? Get up, walk it off. So she gets up, and he looks down, and she's bleeding a little bit, pants are ripped. And he said, you're going to need a new pair of pants, aren't you? And then told her, okay, go put your horses away. He was just as tough on his own girls as he was anybody else. And I can't imagine the pressure that you guys were under being the daughter of Glen Keller, and you were both amazing. I watched you all the way through. She also, Grace, failed her first Red Team exam. and her first chance to go to red team. And she was dejected, but Papa said, "You're just going to have to try harder, and I'll help." And he helped by making her stand at the door every single time she came over to the house, and she would have to repeat the entire drill before he'd allow her. In, force down the center, split at the rail, double thread. And then when she was on team, she had some spacing issues, and he would yell over that loudspeaker as loud as he could, "Grace, double space!" Which just means she wasn't quite getting enough room on threads and things like that. Caroline's memories are also equally fond. She rode Cowboy and Lucy, which were kept at the Keller's place throughout Western Airs. Cowboy was her favorite. For a while she couldn't ride Cowboy because he was injured, so she started riding Lucy. Lucy hurt an eye on her graduation trip, and so she had to switch to Cowboy, who ended up doing absolutely fine, and her fondest memory is leading corkscrew on Cowboy for her final ride. Can't imagine how special that was. She says, and very adamantly, in the arena she was a rider, and Grandpa never showed her any special treatment. If she did something wrong, he yelled at her just as much as he would anybody else. But outside the arena, he was the most wonderful grandpa she could have ever had. Almost more like a dad than a grandfather. When she came over, he would always say, "Here comes trouble." That was his favorite line for her. And he always told the granddaughters that he was very, very proud of them. Mike Alsoffer tells a story of being the teeniest little tenderfoot coming into Western Airs. And Glen would joke about that Well, anyway, he's only been in the organization a few weeks, and it's safety lecture where Glen would take the kids and teach them some of the basic principles of riding and safety. And who does he pick out as an example immediately? The littlest guy there. He brings Mike up and immediately throws him on 17 hand-high silver. From that point on, Mike Alsoffer wasn't scared of any horse out there. When he was 9 years old, he was the only boy on Hoedowners, and Mike rode a pony named Mike. So the joke was, it was Mike on Mike. Well, at one show, Mike, that was a different story. Mike decided to take off. Mike Alsoffer already had blistered hands from how often this horse would do that. Anyway, the horse ripped out of his hands, tore across the arena, and here comes Glen over the loudspeaker. There goes Mike on Mike, showing off for the girls. A couple of other quick stories that came in. And it's interesting, two people who did not communicate, who I just asked to share a story, actually had an opposing story, an opposite viewpoint from the same show, which I thought was really cool. So this is coming from Chris Alsoffer. Red Team was invited to ride at a rodeo in Burwell, Nebraska in July. Mr. Keller had a court case that he had to stay in Denver to see, so he asked Lee to drive his car with Liz, and he came later. So anyway, during the drive, Lee started to feel very hot and overheated, complained, and kept turning on the air conditioning full blast to the point where Liz had to put a little heater on her side. Well, at some point during the drive, Liz looks over and she goes, "You idiot, your car seat heater's on." That story has been told many, many times over the years. Now, from the same show, we have a viewpoint of Mr. Art Geis, our former assistant director. Red Team was to perform in Burwell, Nebraska at what they call their biggest rodeo. But Glen had a court appearance in Denver and couldn't travel with the team. So he appeared in court advising the judge that he needed to hurry so he could get to Burwell for his graduation. The judge moved the proceedings along quite smartly. Then Glen chartered a plane to fly him to Burwell. As the team was practicing in the afternoon before the show, an airplane buzzed the arena, and we all know who was in it. The announcer that night at the rodeo was none other than the very famous Hadley Barrett. And he and Glen had the best time that night and the best announcing he'd ever heard. And Art was so impressed that Glen was so committed to being there that he was willing to charter a plane to get there. Linda Crook also wanted to point out, and I think it's a beautiful thing, that Glen always wanted to include, if there was time, a side trip to learn something about the area they were in, to learn some history. And she talks about a few. I'll give you a couple. One, they had a trip to Washington, Kansas about 12 years ago. And Mr. Keller, in his own time, arranged a side trip to see a Pony Express way station where we were given a tour and the riders had to just dress up in pioneer period clothing. That's pretty cool that he would take the time to do those sort of things. In Cuba, New Mexico, the riders attended their first ever all Navajo rodeos, observed sheep auctions and other culture events. Each year, Red Team riders were invited by the Native Americans to their annual powwow and were asked to dance with them, an exceptional invitation. Those are some little extra things that this man thought about. Not only, give this town, these people a good performance, but while we're there, let's learn a little something. He was incredible historian. I'd also like to read one more thing that came in that I was trying to find some of these words myself, but I don't think they could have come any better than this from the National Western Stock Show. With a heavy heart, we write you today at the passing of Glen Keller, former director of the Western Airs. Mr. Keller became director of the Western Airs in 1983 and oversaw tremendous growth in the program, making it one of the best riding clubs in the world. In a recent article from the Arvada Press, Glen stated, "Being part of the Western Airs gives kids the opportunity to learn leadership, self-respect, and personal responsibility by using horsemanship and participation. There's something magic that bonds horses and kids. That bonds helps them to become responsible adults." Under Glen's leadership, the Western Airs became a featured part of every rodeo performance at the National Western Stock Show, and he expanded into many other areas, such as evening and dancing horses. He was a man of high principles who led by example. The leadership of the National Western Stock Show will forever remember Glen Keller as a stock show legend, and our thoughts and prayers go out to his family in this difficult time. Signed by Douglas Jones, Chairman of the Board, and thank you, Mr. Paul Andrews, President and CEO. And we love the National Western Stock Show. As I begin to wrap things up just a little bit, these stories could go on and on and on. Mr. Vick or Mr. Andrews could come up here and talk for an hour just about our involvement with stock shows over the years. One of Glen's law partners could stand up for an hour and talk about his career and add so many more insights into that. There's just so much to this man. And when he left Western Airs, and in the spirit of condolence and sympathy at a time like this, I'll put it as politely as I can, it wasn't completely on his terms. And we'll leave it there. But the way everything went down, it was difficult. And Glen and Liz had a very difficult time letting go of the reins of Western Airs. And I don't blame them, not one single bit. At the same time, Glen was enduring physical pain and difficulties none of us can imagine. He went through a massive back surgery, fusing multiple discs, followed by a serious infection, more surgeries. When I visited him during that period, it was absolutely heartbreaking to see a man I looked at as, he was a legend to me from early on. And it was hard to see him hurting both mentally and physically. But you know what? I noticed a few things. One, no matter how he felt, no matter what day it was, even if I just dropped in out of nowhere, he looked sharp. He always dressed sharp, and he always looked sharp. Not once did I come over there and he was in a bathrobe or sweatpants, and he always looked nice. I also noticed that he didn't complain, he didn't hide it. You know, he couldn't hide it. You're in that kind of pain. I would see him move in his chair an inch and grimace, but he didn't complain. And I also saw that his wit and his humor, his intelligence, his wisdom was still there. And he loved a good talk, and it didn't matter what subject. We used to talk politics a lot. As you know, Glen was a conservative, but it really surprised me that during one of our talks, I think we were talking about this last presidential election, he told me, I'm kind of tired of extremes. He said, what I believe we need right now is a moderate, preferably a conservative leaning moderate, but someone who could reach across the aisle and start to get people talking again and end some of this division and partisanship. We've got to make some things happen. What's going on in Washington right now, he says, it's breaking his heart. And I was just blown away by that. You know, that here, this staunch conservative man, he just wanted healing. He just wanted to see our country not feel so divided. He also talked a lot about the Western heirs, and once he began to accept and let go of losing those reins, all he wanted was to see Western heirs survive. He just wanted to see an organization that meant so much to so many, that had created so many fine young adults, just continue on. And it was frustrating for him to not be able to help as much as he once did. But his heart and soul were completely behind that program. He also, at one time, made a comment to me that kind of shocked me. He said, looking back, I kind of at times wish I'd been a little less stern. And I think he felt like he had to be. It's very difficult when you're a leader of a big organization with lots of volunteers and kids. You can't let yourself be close to every single one. It's too emotionally taxing. But as he looked back, he sometimes thought, maybe I was a little too strict at times. But I think that happens when you're a little bit humbled by time, by age, by illness. And he was just so thoughtful and just so congenial in our conversations. I regret deeply now I haven't gone over to visit him even more often, because every time I did, I would learn something. I would learn a piece of wisdom. I would laugh. I would find something more out about his life. You know, there was a man, a lawyer, a very flawed man, who was asked to take over a very large institution. And it was kind of thrown in his lap. But this man was brilliant. Brilliant beyond what people realized. People mocked him. A lot of people didn't like him. But he was the right man at the right time, and he saved that institution. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He was a backwoods lawyer with deep flaws. But our country needed him at exactly that moment, and he is one of the greatest men in our history. Why do I bring up his name? Well, we had a backwoods lawyer, savvy, smart, who came into our organization, and in my opinion, brought it to new heights and somewhat saved it. We had a little bit of Abraham Lincoln right there with us. Maybe we didn't even realize it. He was also a little bit like a general. I like to compare him a little bit, full blood and guts, Patton. And Patton was not a soldier's general like Omar Bradley was. Patton was much tougher. He didn't let himself get too close to the troops, but they fought for him because they respected him. And so we had a little bit of George Patton out there with us, maybe without realizing it. And when you look at pictures of Glen Keller in his Stetson hat and his cowboy boots, he looked a little bit like a Western hero, didn't he? Larger than life. We had a little bit of John Wayne right there. In my opinion, we have a little bit of Lincoln, Patton, and John Wayne, all rolled into one individual that can never be replaced. A little show of hands. How many people in this room have had at least one dream that included Glen Keller? I had a dream one time that he came over to me. I was taking pictures of the show. And he said, "Green, we need you." And I throw down my camera, and they were a boy short for varsity red team. This couldn't happen in real life if you paid me $1 million. But I hopped on that horse, and I did a red tea grill in my dream. So, I think a lot of us don't realize Glen Keller basically gave up his retirement, gave it up for Western heirs. He'd been a lawyer and a judge. He had the means, the retirement, to do anything he wanted. If I had been like that, I would have wanted to travel the world. I would have wanted to do all these other things. I'm kind of an adventure guy. No, not Glen. He spent all of his retirement and so much of his hard work and effort on the Western heirs. And not for self-glory. He knew this was an organization that produced young people that this world desperately needs. You look at the newspapers right now, or the news, there are young people out there in this world so lost, so confused. You have to worry about our future. But the kids that have gone through Western heirs, most of them have good head schools. They've learned self-discipline, respect, patriotism, and so many virtues that this country desperately needs. And that's why he did it. It was that humble beginnings in a small town in Colorado that taught him what it means to be an American, what it means to be a good person, and that's why he dedicated his life to that organization. Glen and Liz were about to celebrate their 63rd anniversary. What a beautiful thing. God bless you. He always called her his bride, which I think is absolutely beautiful. Glen Keller will be interred this afternoon at a private ceremony right up there. Look out that window for a moment. This could all be a random thing that happened with physics and just ending up in the right place after the Big Bang, but that's God out there to me. That's the miracle of God. Flowers, trees, mountains. How did this all just magically happen? Well, Glen is going to be right up there in those mountains. Everybody know that cross that you can see above Denver at night? That's where he's going to be, right at the tip of that cross on top of Mount Lindo. He didn't talk often about God, but I heard several conversations where he would mention the man upstairs and what he would want and what he would believe in. But in that man somewhere was a very strong faith, and I'm absolutely positive that he is with our Maker right now. You know, we come into this world as an innocent child of God. Then we go through this incredibly difficult struggle and journey that we call life. And oftentimes at the end, we are once again an innocent child of God, needing care, needing help. But on that journey, and in the end, we've gained something irreplaceable. We have gained knowledge, we have gained wisdom, and hopefully become more humble and ready to meet our Maker. And I think Glen was truly there. He had an amazing life, but he was ready. He was very humble in the end, and I think he knew the time was close. I like to think of him up there waiting in front of St. Peter's chair right now, and St. Peter's looking down at him, and Glen yells up, "You gonna open that gate and get me a horse, or you just gonna sit there?" Glen Keller was truly one of the finest men that I have ever known. He had so much knowledge, so much experience, so much wisdom. I can't begin to say enough good things about this man. I have several heroes in my life, one of whom was a colonel who was the chief of staff at West Point and personally worked with 6 different presidents. I put Glen Keller in that league. In fact, I might even put Glen Keller right here as my #1 favorite hero and the finest man that I've ever known. It has been a tremendous honor to be here today and to speak to you all. I pray that I've painted a good picture of this incredible man, and I'm just very thankful. I know you will join me in sharing our love and condolences to his family. And again, thank you all for being here. They say that if you really want to know someone, walk a mile in their shoes. In this case, it would be cowboy boots. And I can tell you something. I couldn't walk 10 feet in these boots. I couldn't even stick my big toe into these boots. There is only one man that could have ever filled these boots. And he is now ridden off into the sunset, like all good cowboys do. Goodbye, dear friend. Thank you. There will never be another like Mr. Glen Keller.